At the early stage of my watercolor practice, I always feel overwhelmed by painting clusters of feather. So today I'm going to share with you 9 tips how I can overcome this fear. I use 4 pigments in this painting: indigo, permanent rose, orange hue, and cobalt turquoise light. Some artists prefer transparent pigment, while others might prefer semi-transparent, opaque, or even super granulation. So it's important to research on your colors or your pigment before you buy them. Negative painting is one of the most important techniques for watercolor. I use this technique in all of my paintings, from painting the background to painting the subjects, and finally is the little detail. If you haven't heard of negative painting before, it's the technique that you paint around the subject rather than the subject itself. If you don't know where to start, always look for the lightest color in your subject. In this case, yellow is my lightest color. You might question, why can't I start with dark color first? Because watercolor is a transparent medium. You can paint dark on top of light color, but when you paint light on top of dark, it won't show much. Even you use the opaque pigment, it's still not as good as painting dark on top of light. The dark pigment can cover the light pigment very easily and make your painting look neat and tidy, creating crisp and sharp edges. You can see that the colors I'm using as underpainting is yellow, and then I use my cobalt turquoise light painting on top, and the yellow is still shine through. That's because watercolor is a transparent medium. Usually I avoid using black pigment straight from the tube because the black pigment that's straight from the tube tend to muddy the color every time I mix with other colors. At the same time, I enjoy mixing my own black by using 3 primary colors or 2 secondary colors. In this case, I use indigo, orange hue, and permanent rose. So we must work from light to dark. For the first layer, I use tea or milk consistency paint. Then I will build up a few more layers on top by follow the feather directions and leaving some highlight. If I reach my full saturation in one layer, then I will lose my chance to build up and create the feather texture and highlight. Using cobalt turquoise light and mix in a little bit of indigo, and then I paint in the shadow area of the turquoise feather. This technique, it will help to define and create the texture of the feather. At the same time, I try to simplify and not to paint every single feather I could see in the reference photo. As a beginner, we all try to match our colors to our subject. There is nothing wrong with that, but what is more important than matching color is the value. I believe we all heard the quote that said, "Value does all the work and colors take all the credit." For example, in this painting, if I want to use just indigo alone for my black, it would look just fine. Let me rephrase it. If I only use indigo alone for my dark color, it would look just fine. But I want to play around with my dark tone. I want my black to have a cooler black versus the warm black. If you look at the photo closely, you would see that some black feather look brown and some actually closer to the blue side. because feathers are not 100% solid, so when the black feather overlaps on the yellow feather, it actually looks brown. And when I have yellow for underpainting already, it's perfect to paint that brown feather. I believe that the ability to see color reflection is very important for your painting skill. And it's also one of the skills that helps you to achieve realism. For instance, in this painting, the bottom beaks of the bird get color reflection from the turquoise feather. And if you pay close attention, the rest of the dark feather on the bird's wing right here, they are not pure black, they are more like brown, grayish, neutral color. I'm using my size 2 round brush here to bring in a few strokes, suggesting the feather texture. With my flat brush, I re-wet the area with clear water, so that I could work on my wet on wet and wet on damp technique, giving the feather in this area a soft look. When I first painting birds using watercolor, I used to feel so overwhelmed by those clusters of feather. From my experience, I found that painting the shadow of each feather is as important as painting the feather itself. By painting the shadow of each feather, it helps to define the feather itself and also help to create the beautiful layerings of feather, showing the clusters of feather, how one feather is laying on top of another. As I work on the shadow, I also be mindful to not cover all the highlight, because feather has silky surface. Therefore, the highlight is as important as the shadow underneath each feather. Having said that, feather direction is very important when it comes to paint birds, and it's probably the most important one compared to the rest. Even though you get the highlight and the shadow correctly, but you haven't followed the feather direction, our bird would look weird for sure. Therefore, I'm carefully placing each brush stroke follow the feather direction. Especially when you use watercolor as your art medium. Watercolor is a transparent medium. Each brush stroke will be visible. Therefore, if our brush stroke didn't follow the feather direction, we will try to fix it by adding another layers on top, and maybe one layers on top of that to cover it. Before you know it, your painting will look overworked, and it's easy to create muddy colors. Now I'm painting the end of the wings. I make sure that I do not make this area too dark or the darkest area of the painting, because I do not want to draw too much attention over here. The last layer is to tidy up, glazing on top of the shadow area of each feather. Make sure I get my value correctly, meaning the dark and light. With clean damp brush, I lift up the color on the backs of the birds here, adding one more layer to the rest of the area, redefine and cleaning up. This is my last layer to tidy up, even the small details around the eyes, and those tiny black feathers around the beaks. So if you look at the reference photo, you will see that the tree trunk that the bird is sitting on is quite complex if you mean to follow it exactly. Having said that, you don't have to follow the reference photo exactly. I look at my reference photo and use it as a guide. I pick up the colors from the reference photo and make sure that it's not darker than the birds. Then I use some dry brush stroke to create the wood texture, bringing the highlight back with whitewash on the beak.